Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another meeting of the Brookside Discussion Group. Tonight, I believe we are honored to have as our speaker Dr. Marc Edmund Jones. And among many of Dr. Jones's books, I have one here called Occult Philosophy. And I'd like to read just a little bit about, as it says here, about the author. Through his lifelong work as writer, editor, and clergyman, Marc Edmund Jones has pursued an ever-increasing interest in occult philosophy. It is his belief that no knowledge of life is adequate if it does not comprise every possible ramification of conscious experience. His first encounter with unorthodox doctrines was shortly after the World's Columbian Exposition at Chicago, when Christian Scientists moved next door. This was a stimulus to a most speculative temperament, already quickened by divided church allegiances within his own family circle. And he still possesses, in boyish high school handwriting, his first fictional romance in which a Christian Science hero discovered how to go back into history or forward into the future by a mere act of thought. Now, in these years, he spent his summers with an aunt who was interested in theosophy, a matter he was cautioned not to mention, leading him to jump to an initial conclusion that she had some strange disease, but soon providing occupation for his investigative mind. And in many other ways, his later inquiries have very early roots. His special studies in the field have occupied a considerable part of his time for more than 3 decades, and his Sabian Assembly or experimental group has been established for more than 2 decades. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marc Edmund Jones, who is going to speak to us on personality transformations in psychic phenomena. Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much. It's a very real pleasure to be here again with the Parastudic group and to share some of the ideas that are taking form gradually in this general field. Because so much of it is new, there is no fixed terminology. Many different phrases are used, many different terms are used. And with no broad acceptance of words and terms, there is, of course, always a basic difficulty of language, what we are talking about when we speak of things in this field. But in the broadest sort of way, we are concerned with the possibilities of the human mind's recognition, awareness of factors in experience that are not immediately measured in time and space terms. My idea in the subject of individuality or personality or physiological changes is an interest in the mechanism of this phenomenon. We speak of extrasensory perception, ESP, or if we are more grounded in the basic occult tradition, we speak of psychic faculties, or we may speak of supernormal phenomena, apparitions, ghosts, appearances, the experience in mystic ecstasy in trance. We may get down to the vernacular of every day and speak of ghosts. But in all of this area, We are fundamentally interested in the extension of the powers of the human mind. In order to talk about it, we have to have a basis. And I'm taking as my basis tonight the human body. The human body is the instrument through which we work. We may speak of extra sense, additional sense, perception, but we are still basically anchored to the human body. Now, there are many differences of opinion as to the nature of the human body and the nature of its functioning. There is obviously a division of labor. We have the ordinary sensory faculties of the body, sensitive to heat and cold, to the drives of life, to appetite, the sense of danger, pleasure, pain. All of these things are part of the normal sensory organization of the human body. But in our social relationships, our relationships of people with people, there is almost immediately more to it than just that. If an individual walks down the street and he sees someone coming, he doesn't say, about 5'8", blonde, dark eyes, long nose, well-dressed, typical attitude. He doesn't say that. He said, that's John. That is, he recognizes an individuality. And that individuality actually is non-definable. It's an intangible proposition. It's part of the faculty of mind. You recognize a familiar person. Now, an individual may be walking down the street, and all at once there sweeps over him a sense of familiarity or something of the sort. He acts in response to that. And again, there is a perfectly objective phenomenon. And he asks, well, now, what did I see? I didn't see anything. What did I hear? I didn't hear anything. There was an awareness of a sort. I acted on that, and such happened. In order to illustrate the phenomenon in the book on hoary astrology, I told a personal experience. I knew that the wives of two intimates of mine in Hollywood were making a trip east. I didn't know when. I expected to see them in New York. On rather short notice, I signed a contract to produce motion picture comedies in Cleveland around the person of a well-known comedian. I went out to Cleveland in the studio that had been rigged up in Cleveland. I was in Cleveland. One Sunday, working away at the notes for the next morning's work, the scenario, as we say in movies, scenario, as we say in the States, an Italian word. I had a feeling I didn't want to be there. I interpreted to myself as a desire to go to church. So I cleaned up, started out. I remembered a church. I walked down. I got outside the church, and I had a feeling I don't want to go there. I thought of another church. I walked down here to this church. I didn't want to go in. I walked to a third church. I didn't want to go in. I said to myself, oh, well, I'll go back and work on the script. Walking back, I passed in front of a hotel just as a car drove up. These two wives of my friends got out of the car, and I rushed up, had to follow them in the lobby. We had a wonderful evening together. Now, what is this phenomenon? That is, we say extrasensory perception, but what do we mean by extrasensory perception?
Guidance.
There's a factor here, there's a common factor in human experience, which is a very important factor in human experience. So that by a perfectly roundabout proposition of working from reaction to reaction, I ended up being on a sidewalk in those few split seconds in which two ladies got out of the car and walked into a hotel. In time to recognize them, follow them into the lobby. Now, I knew they were coming. I didn't know when. They had no idea I was in Cleveland. When we get into this area, there are a number of things that we can do. We can say, all right, this is the physical level. Here is something above the physical level. This is a phenomenon above the physical level. But the minute we take ourselves off the physical level to explain something up here, we have arrived on a level of indeterminate something where the likelihood of unreliability, of delusion, of fantasy, of everything else is so great that it becomes distinctly dangerous. So that slowly, as with the work of Dr. Ryan down the tradition of extrasensory perception, or in the realm of a more traditional occultism where we deal with psychic faculties, as we call them, or use the word intuition, a much abused term. Intuition is a common, easy label for anything you can't explain. If I know this for a reason that I can explain, I explain it that way. If I can't explain it, but I know it, I say, well, that's intuition. So we say, by intuition, I know that it's worth $10 instead of $5. By intuition, I know that I should go here instead of here. And about half the time, intuition is wonderfully and spectacularly wrong, as many of us have discovered when we try to follow the intangibility of the intangible. As I see it, the great necessity is the necessity of an anchorage in the reliable. To me, it seems to be a waste of time, of energy, of resources to pursue a will-o'-the-wisp, to pursue something on which we can't put a finger, to fall into the fallacy of the green pastures. This own pasture is pretty poor. But over there, that's wonderful. That's green. So we go for that one over there and find that's pretty poor. And we go for this one over here, which is pretty poor. We do that in every area of life. A wonderful American phenomenon of polygamy. I'm taking now the suggestion made by Chinese who listened to somebody talking about the places in the world where they had polygamy and picked on certain sections of China where people had multiple lives. So the Chinese objected to it. He said, I think that our polygamy is much better than yours. And I said, well, we don't have any. Of course, the Mormons there, but that's stopped by law now. We don't have any polygamy. And the Chinese said, you don't understand me. Said, we have concurrent polygamy. You have successive polygamy. We take care of our wives and we take care of all of them, but you throw them out to starve unless the court gets alimony from you, and you go from wife to wife and wife to wife. We don't like that. We think that's a pretty poor form of polygamy. In the area of polygamy, where you marry the sweet creature, oh, she was so nice, and then you discover she isn't that nice, and junker. Here is this possibility over here, that doesn't work out, junker. Or it goes the other way too, but there are too many ladies in Soviets. I won't express it in reverse. But it is the idea that the remote the unexplainable. Well, I put it this way. I once heard a person testify to the efficacy of Christian Science. I hope there are no Christian Science present, because this is not complimentary to Christian Science. It's not my point of view I'm quoting. He says the beauty of science and health, key to the scriptures, is it is so completely incomprehensible, so completely mixed up, that a mixed up person reading it finds a fellowship with the mixed upness of the book. That gives him a reconciliation with reality and solves all his problems. This idea of reaching out into the occult, reaching out into the unexplainable, reaching out beyond ordinary experience, may solve problems tentatively, but in the long run, it doesn't solve them at all, because it is a flight from reality. Our basic reality lies in this much abused temple of the flesh, this physical body. Our senses are anchored in this physical body. Our experience is anchored in this physical world. And so it seems to me that perhaps our analysis should begin with this physical phenomenon as a basis for what we have by way of super physical things. As a matter of fact, it's quite simple. If you have a super something, you happen to super anything if the something of which it is super is denied. You say, I want super physical, and you deny the physical, then it is super what? It is super physical, it is super your denial. And super denial is simply mix up and trouble and difficulty, no matter where we go. So let us take a look at the physical body. I'm speaking of physical changes or individuality changes in connection with superphysical experience. That is, in a roundabout way, I'm speaking of the fact that there must be change or alteration in the foundation of anything that adds up as change or alteration in our realization. Many questions arise in connection with this, and I cannot cover them all in an evening. If we deal with the matter of discarnate activity, discarnate entities, the question is, where is the physical body? But a close investigation of all phenomena of discarnate entities involves the presence of a physical vehicle in one way or another. In theosophical terms, a master of wisdom who is discarnate functions through a chela who provides the body for the manifestation. For better or worse, our being comes down to the matter of this physical body, this physical situation on a physical world. And so the foundation should rest there for the sake of basic sanity. Now, in occultism, there are many, many traditions concerning the physical body. Some of us who have pursued the quest to varying degrees of alignment with what in a general way we call astrology, deal with two traditions. These traditions hold for non-astrological occultism as well as for astrological areas, astrological investigation. Astrology is merely a means of thinking about human existence in terms of the cycles in which human existence functions. The beginning of astrology is the seasons, winter, autumn, the change in the sun, the changes in the moon, the physiological functions that move with the moon, the tides move with the moon, the liquid balances in living organisms move with the moon, the sun and the moon, and then by progression, other derivative cycles. There is a way of thinking that is astrological. The value of it is in the fact that through the past 3 or 4 centuries, where the rationalism of the Renaissance came in and came to be enthroned in all men's thinking, that enthronement of rationalism did not concern itself with astrology because astrology was outside the pale. So that astrology has remained our one major mathematical means of approach to things that has not got caught up in the rationalistic fallacies that are the plague of practically all our other scientific thinking. So there's a certain value in it. Astrology is not a horoscope proposition primarily. It is primarily a way of thinking. It is a way of thinking that says that anything must be thought through in the area of the largest whole, W-H-O-L-E, that may be envisioned. That is, if we think of anything without thinking of it in terms of the totality that is concerned, the thinking is fragmented. We think of human beings in the total of mankind, the total makeup of mankind. Must be implicit in our thinking to think of the individual intelligently. Otherwise, we get all caught up in prejudices. If we say there are certain races that are inferior, there are certain races that are superior, there are certain cultures that are superior, there are certain cultures that are inferior, we're enthroning ourselves in prejudices and our thinking is not sound, and we find ourselves ending up with fallacies and non-understanding. We have to have a whole, W-H-O-L-E, in which to think about anything. So in our scientific work, in mathematics and physics, chemistry, we think in terms of the whole. Ketterling died recently, the man who invented the self-starter, invented ethyl gasoline, a lot of things. In his development of ethyl gasoline, when they exhausted everything they could think of, and then funning around, having fun, they put iodine in it, and iodine worked. Then they went to the table of valences. In the field of chemistry, all chemical elements divide in recognizable elements, which may be separated as an explanation of the way combinations act. And so they went to the table of valences having iodine, and they discovered that they could use a form of lead, tetraethyl lead, and you have not gasoline. That is, the scientific structure is based upon the notion of wholes. In physics, the sense of the fact that the universe is a totality, and any individual phenomenon in the whole universe is a part of that totality. This ceramic, pyroceramic that they developed now, a new form of glass that will not crack or split in terms of great changes in temperature, was developed for the cones of missiles, but it is now put on the market for housewives because it is very useful. But that was entirely a matter of the total knowledge of the physical and chemical action of substances, so that the glass people in their research developing what was needed for missiles could provide something that's very handy in the kitchen. Always we think in terms of totals. And so we think in terms of total humanity. this physical body is a totality because all human beings handle this physical body. The mammalian structure, man, the primates, and a whole lot of creatures are functioning in this physical structure, this physical chemical balance that we call the human body. Now, that is a constant. That is the totality as far as human experience is concerned. And so we can learn to our advantage an immense amount of practical things when it comes to superphysical phenomena, because we're still dealing with the body. If you're in a spiritualistic seance and there is a materialization, the materialization is in terms of the human body and follows the laws of the human body. If you bridge over time and space and work from a body that is here and a body that is long since dead, you are still dealing with a body. If you're dealing with the future, you are still dealing with a body. So this is one of the two great traditions in occultism, the type of wisdom that derives basically from the human body and its characteristics. The simplest word for this is hermetic. Hermetic or Egyptian. There was a form of divination or astrology that is associated with the idea of Egypt, which is primarily a matter of the performance of bodies. When they used animal sacrifices, the animals were killed on the altar, the entrails were taken out, and the way the entrails lay, the heart and the other organs relative to each other, was a means of divination. That is divination by means of the human body or of the animal body, as the case may be. The divisions of the body, its various areas of functioning. These become of an immense importance in modern occultism, especially in theosophy, with the idea of the vehicles, the levels, the chakric centers, the worlds of experience, the planes of experience. But it all comes back ultimately to the fact of the body, the way in which the body develops embryologically is fine occult training for these things with which we are dealing. The sensitive points of the body, such simple facts as in ancient worlds, prayer was standing on your feet and raising your arm. In modern practice, almost universally, being down on your knees and bending the head. All this is basic symbolism that depends upon the stresses and strains and the structures of the human body. Now, a very big problem that we have in all this research is the matter of validity. There are people who are rather naive and assume that anything that comes by superphysical means is valid. Just as there are many people who assume that anything that their mind thinks through is valid. That is, that thinking is automatically correct. That psychic derived material is automatically correct. Nothing is truer from the fact than that. If you go back in the huge occult literature and examine all the material, you'll be amazed at the amount of the amount of psychically derived material that simply is not valid at all, that has become completely discredited. A psychic faculty may reveal something, and yet By and large, at least in my experience, observing very carefully what is done by way of prediction by psychics on the spiritualistic side, by astrologers on the conventional astrology side, is that by and large the reliability is a little less than the reliability that would be obtained by the ordinary use of common sense. There is no guarantee that anything psychically derived is correct. And that would be the expectation by and large, because what is psychically derived is wholly individual and it does not have the validation of the whole group. And so it is more susceptible to being distorted by the preset of the mind, by the prejudices of the mind. This was illustrated in the course of the recent wars, World War I, World War II. In World War I, on the eastern seaboard here in America, the one astrologer that predicted German victory was a German. And the English astrologers, the American astrologers, predicted Allied victory. They happened to be right. But the fact of interest is not who was right or who was wrong, but the fact that there was a preset. So the German astrologers saw German victory, the Allied astrologers saw Allied victory. The prejudice was stronger than the insight. The mere fact that something comes by a supersensory idea is a matter of suspicion unless there is validation. The validation comes from the use of the human body in a supersensory fashion. That is, if we are going to deal with extrasensory perception, we should deal with extrasensory perception by extrasensitized vehicles of the extrasensory perceptionists. Now, this has often been stressed in occultism, but the idea that if a person was spiritual, his insights would be correct. That, unfortunately, is a sort of a superficial idea. In a way, I grew up on that, the idea that the person was perfectly moral and really religious, who was a vegetarian, who didn't touch coffee or liquor or anything of the kind, would be a competent astrologer, but I found that wasn't so. I found the competent astrologers were those who knew their astrology well, irrespective of whether they drank or didn't drink coffee, smoked or didn't smoke, ate meat or didn't eat meat. See, is competency, and as far as astrology is concerned, the basic of the competency is the knowledge of the astrological mechanism, the same as in anything else. It would be perfectly ridiculous if you said a doctor is a good doctor if he doesn't eat meat, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't swear, he doesn't take the name of the Lord in vain, he doesn't live a sex life, and so forth and so on down the line. That makes him a good doctor. He doesn't do anything of the kind. Dissipation, obviously, disintegrates the senses, debases them, fuzzes them. But to say that there is a moral relationship between competency and incompetency is just not correct. And actually, in the history of occultism, some of the greatest contributors to occultism is from people who in their personal lives were rascals. Of all the dictators that we've had in recent history, the one man who served his people perhaps most unselfishly and produced the greatest revolution in the understanding and lives of his people was a man who in his personal life was as despicable as Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar in history was probably the most personally unadmirable man we have. But Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, in his personal life, was completely dissipated, completely amoral, completely despicable, but he served his Turkish people with an unswerving unselfishness in his contribution, in the working out of the various problems. The two things do not run hand in hand. Frequently, we have people in the occult field who have made tremendous contributions, but whose personal lives we cannot applaud. It is wonderful if you have the great contribution and also have the contribution of an admirable personal life. But competency is the result of competency. It is not the result of conformity to a moral code. So in the world's great religions, we have one of the greatest of them, created by a man who suffered from epileptic fits and whose religion never would have been started except that his ambitious wife had to make something out of him and decided that the wonderful poetry he wrote to his epileptic fits was worth more than his utter incompetency as a trader with a caravan. And so Khadija, is that her name, the wife of Mohammed, decided that she would get behind his religious contribution. That started one of our major religions. And the Quran is beautiful poetry. And the contribution is beautiful. Muhammad is not particularly an admirable man, even though he belonged to the Quraysh, the greatest of the clans, the most elite of the clans there at Mecca. If we try to confuse ourselves by not relating the proper things, we simply get in difficulties. And to say that the good people make the great contribution to life simply is not so. Now, you have your wonderful spiritual people whose lives have been almost beyond reproach, at least in the major things, and even there, when you get down to the petty things, it is not quite so pleasant a picture. Human beings are mixed creatures. So I'm back to my main theme, the importance of an anchorage in everyday reality as far as extrasensory perception is concerned, as far as spiritual understanding is concerned. We need to realize that we are anchored in a practical world, and the anchorage in the practical world is what counts in the efficiency of what we are doing. The moral issue is admirable. But it's mostly admirable for the person, because if a person is moral, his life is happier. But his contribution may be equally great if he is not so moral an individual. You know the story of Abraham Lincoln. They came to him and said, General Grant is a drunkard, really. He hits the bottle, and Lincoln said, would you mind finding out what the brand is? I have some other generals to whom I would like to send some. Apparently, there's a basis for that story in history. Thomas seems to think there's a basis for it. Grant was a drunkard. His performance at Vicksburg, when it began to be too monotonous for Grant, there was a newspaper man on his last bender that brought him back to camp and got him to bed and kept him in bed before he completely disgraced the Union cause. We mustn't blind ourselves to these things. But Lincoln saw the point. The point was that Grant was a man that was needed for the particular proposition. And so he wanted Grant for that, even though there were some unadmirable things about Grant. I like to take the imaginative story of the young lady who falls in the water and is about to drown. There are two men on the pier. One man is a deacon in the church. He's a spiritual individual. He just radiates spirituality, but he can't swim. The other man is the town rake. To speak to him in public is to ruin a girl's reputation. He's a wonderful swimmer. She's about to drown. She needs help. To which should she appeal? Should she drown with a man of virtue, or should she to the town rake and trust to luck that somehow or other she could show her gratitude without ruining her reputation. So this is a magic deal, but I hope it draws attention to the very important fact that when we are dealing with things that are pertinent, we're dealing with the things that are pertinent, and the other things that come in are only relatively pertinent. So it's a matter in this transition age of contributing to a world that's badly in need of spiritual contribution, that's badly in need to an awakening of the powers of the human mind. What's important? To awaken the world to the values of the human mind, or to draw narrow moral codes about who does the awakening. As I'd rather have somebody that quicken the world so the world goes forward in progress than have somebody who, according to my particular prejudice, is a nice, pretty, lovely, nice little man that I can say, God loves him. We have a practical proposition as I see it, and that practical proposition is to get at these greater powers of the human mind. Now, to do that is necessary to get at the physical body. If we are having extrasensory powers, we have to have extra experience. We have to have an intensified experience. Unfortunately, the intensified experience is usually gained by people who are either in trouble or misery or agony of some sort through personal circumstances, or who intensify their experience by misbehavior. The people who have made great contributions to progress and who have been drunkards, or who, like Julius Caesar or Ataturk, have been despicable individuals. The important thing is the intensification of human experience. Now, I'm not talking against morality, but I'm talking against morality as a kind of a sleeping pill, so a person who becomes moral doesn't have to exert himself anymore. I would rather have him immoral and exert himself than moral and not exert himself. I hope I'm not shocking anybody with my point of view. The important thing is that we awaken to our powers. And if the awakening to our powers comes from people that are not as pleasing as people who would be pleasing, then we have a twofold job. One fold job is not interfere with the people who are doing the work, and the other job is to get a hold of these smug people who are so doggone decent that they don't exert themselves over anything of importance, and poke them and poke them and poke them and poke them until they wake up to the fact that we have to do something in this transition age if we are going to achieve our destiny. In other words, we defeat our ends over and over again, we in the people of superior position in this world, by being overexcited over our moral excellency. Our excellency is of no importance if we don't put it to work. I'm a basic pragmatist, and decency that doesn't work at something is a stench to the nostrils. Static decency is a pain in the neck, if I am not stating it too emphatically. I'm in favor of decency, but I'm in favor of decency because your life is pleasant when you're decent. Life is rewarding when you're decent. But as a social contribution, it merely means that you give the police less work, that's all. Now, maybe I'm overstressing.
Are you afraid of being injured?
Hold till we have a question session a little later. Now, the problem is, as far as the physical body, in this matter of intensity. There is an occult tradition that the blood in the brain is vaporized. And the vaporization of the blood is the basis of all the superior functions of the mind. There is some faint support for this in recent work in the medical field dealing with the quieting of the functions to permit delicate operations, as most specifically on the heart. It has been discovered that one of the greatest dangers in the various freezing techniques, quieting techniques, in the fact the blood supply to the brain is impeded. And if the blood supply to the brain is impeded, then there's very great danger. Life is canceled out, or sanity is canceled out. And so efforts have been made, and there is some recent success in techniques for keeping the blood supply to the brain adequate while the blood supply to the rest of the body is cut down. This is a sort of a roundabout general support of the occult tradition. The occult tradition can't be proved. Nobody has conceived of a way for testing it in the laboratory. And of course, the minute that anything is done with the circulation, the phenomenon would cease. There's also in this connection, which is virtually the same thing, the idea that the spinal fluid at the top is vaporized. That is, that it is raised in a degree of intensity. First you have solidity at the bottom of your physical scale, then you have liquidity, and then you have gaseousness or vaporization. And there is, the occultist at least, can state that the vaporization of the liquid tissue, blood is a tissue, it's a kind of a tissue, the same as the tissue of muscle or the tissue of nerves or the other tissues of the body, but it's a liquid tissue as it's defined in medical science. The blood as a tissue, because it is liquid in a state, is capable of vaporization in other parts of itself. And this vaporization apparently is the basis of consciousness, of normal consciousness. Fatigue is a falling off in the vaporization. But if something becomes suddenly important to the consciousness, suddenly important in the life, so that the life is quickened, the fatigue disappears because the vaporization is sustained by an intensification of experience, an intensification of realization. This suggests that a very great deal of our extrasensory phenomena are contingent upon, are modified by, controlled through, and expanded by means of this phenomenon. So that many of the techniques in a roundabout way intensify this proposition. Many of the meditative techniques, the techniques of a supernormal consciousness through great devotion or something of the sort. You see, always, practically in everything, whether it's in Christian mysticism or in the Eastern meditation pattern, everything that leads to the development of an exaltation of the self, of the consciousness flowing out of itself, is, in a sense, this matter of the vaporization of the life fluid in the skull structure. The structure of the skull is very interesting because it is a pattern of the temple. When it is possible to obtain They're very rare. I had the loan of one for a long while and never have been able to possess one. A completely dissociated skull. It's very difficult to get because usually the skull is broken up in the attempt to get it apart. But where you can get a perfect skull, dissociated, so you see all the structure, you get all the symbolism of the temple, the flying wings, the sense of the all-seeing eye with the expansion of consciousness. The skull is the temple. And in here, in the worship of the temple within self, as the consciousness constricted by the bony structure and thereby intensified as you get heat intensified in a furnace, as you build up the intensity of any relationship in our time and space world. This intensity is the secret. This physical intensity is the sustainment of the supernormal consciousness, the creative consciousness, or whatever it may be. In the case of great agony of spirit, things are possible to accomplish that cannot be accomplished normally. In the case of sickness, the same thing can happen. In the case of very great fatigue followed by stimulus, the same thing can happen. Fatigue is a phenomenon of a building up of the elements, the residual elements of the activity of consciousness within the body, so they have to be eliminated. But their presence, when there is a heightening, adds to the heightening. So that in the case of the great seers, the great prophetic souls, there is this element that we find, and it is fundamentally found in the physiological change as its anchorage. What's the practical meaning of this? The practical meaning is the development of this as a skill, not as something given by the gods, not as something that just happens, but as a developed skill, as you develop a skill of the hand, or a skill of the mind, or any other skill. It actually is a skill of the mind, so that an individual learns that as he mingles with his fellows, as he shares experience with his fellows, he finds situations of agony in sympathy that builds to this. A man whose heart breaks. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, shall I ever forget thee?" sang the Hebrews on the banks of the river in Babylon. And as a result of that came the development of the church. What we call the church was developed in Babylon, for the Hebrews had lost their temple, the centralized worship, but they missed it. There was a sense of missing for which they made complementation. They had to hold to their Sabbath, so they gathered at the river. They did no work. Gathering at the river, they got in the habit of reading the scriptures. They read the scripture, its associations swept in upon them. They sang hymn, and there became a feeling that the gathering of that, the coming together, the synagogue, the coming together, the communion, the coming together, the ecclesia, which has the same idea in Greek, the idea of the congregation of experience, of the sharing of a heightened experience for the moment, began to have power. When they came back to the Holy Land, they brought the synagogue. When Christianity developed, it developed the synagogue, and gradually the idea spread. Under the more patriarchal form of the East, the same situation with the master and his ashram and the group of those who came together to serve, where the composite agony of the group coming in on the individual increased the pressures on the individual, and under those pressures, the intensification of those pressures, adding to the heat, the ecstasy, the pain, whatever you call it, of the vaporized blood brings spiritual power. That's the basis of the healing that comes from that, of everything else. So the practical proposition comes down to the value of developing this as a skill, developing the capacity to intensify experience, to bring to a point in self as pertinent to self the great need or whatever it may be. So we say that most of the progress of the world has been at the hands of sick people or frustrated people or persecuted people, because the agony is great. And out of the great agony comes progress. Need we go through the agony? No. But we should go through the agony as ecstasy. Ecstasy is agony that you invite and like. Agony is ecstasy you don't want, you wish somebody would take away from you. But they're the same thing. So that as you have agony or ecstasy, there is a potential here for the larger life. Now, some among us develop this to the point of serving the rest of us, but all among us should have it at least to the point of a basic contribution to our own self-fulfillment. So life should be a matter of intensification, first of all. And those of us who are interested in these things and study these things, we should welcome intensification. Now there is the way of developing this intensification. First, perhaps this order that I'm giving is, there's no importance in the order. It's just a spontaneous order. It's the ideas as I put them down in my notes. First is the idea of living in sympathy. It's a tremendously soul-starved individual who's not moved to tears once or twice a day, or at least every other day. If you can't be moved to the point of shedding tears, which is astral bleeding, the life is sort of soul-starved, starved. It's soul-scarred too. It's almost a necessity. When T.E. Lawrence of Arabia got to knowing the Arabs very well, he discovered that with an Arab, it wasn't manly to cry or laugh, but yet, when circumstances made it justifiable to cry or laugh, it was the greatest fulfillment of all. And so in his Desert in Arabia, or his Seven Pillars, which was the bigger book from which the smaller was taken, you get many instances where these Arabs, as he would do it one way or another, would be moved to this spontaneous giving of themselves to their emotion, when they would roll on the ground in laughter or tears. The Hebrews, you see, your Semite people, the Hebrews, the Arabs, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and so on down the line, is that strain of people who have given us the one great facet of our spiritual realization. That is the idea of the incandescence of spirit. That's the great Semite contribution, the incandescent spirit. Sometimes when you're annoyed at the modern Jew because of his incandescence, which can be very annoying, remember that that's a wonderful heritage to the whole of our culture, you see. There was a man was interminable in his story, so T.E. Lawrence burlesqued him with his pointlessness. The other day, a man came into camp late at night and everything was still, and he came up to a point and he stopped and he looked off and saw nothing. Then he turned over here, and all at once there was a stirring, and he listened carefully for a sound. There was no sound. And he went on with this thing with a very straight face, and after a little bit, the Arabs got the point. How they rolled in laughter over on the ground was their first experience with burlesque, with having an idea of burlesque. They recognized it immediately. And as far as the individual who used to have these pointless, interminable stories, he never indulged it again. Now, life should be enriched with tears. Even if you can't do any better than going to one of these unbelievably awful movies and shedding tears over something that happened to somebody. We should lose tears, and fairly frequently. That is, unless you can be brought to incandescence, you're not alive. That's the important part in this, with this extrasensory perception. And for extrasensory perception, you have to have it. Your St. Francis of Assisi, or your great mystics. The point of the utter futility, the utter tragedy. So these exiles in Babylon, more prosperous than they'd ever been in their life, making more money than they had ever known, having more privileges than they ever had known, almost an elite there in Nebuchadnezzar's 40 golden years. Life had never been as rich for them, but they missed that strange something, necessity for sacrifice to Yahweh, the fire god from Sinai, the volcano cult that came in with the Kenites into the Hebrew picture. They missed that. And so they got down to the river and they read the law. They rehearsed the law. They read it over. They sang some hymn, and the tears streamed down that, oh, Jerusalem, shall ever forget thee. Did many of them go back? Very few. Read Ezra and Nehemiah. Very few of them went back. Babylon was too nice, too sweet. They couldn't miss that. So Babylon was the center of Jewish culture from about the 6th century BC to the 9th, 10th, or 11th century AD. The Babylonian Talmud is the Talmud. The Babylonian schools were the school. They didn't go back. But at least on the riverbank, they had the decency to shed tears over it. You move to tears. You move to something that's emotional. Your eyes well up. That's life. That's being alive. Tears are astral bleeding. And if you can't bleed for something in actuality, you can bleed for something in token, in sympathy. The physical body provides that in the structure of the tear ducts and the way they're coupled in to the whole thing and the matter of the whole economy of the liquids of the body in the eternal cycles. The habit patterns are of vast importance in the development of extrasensory perception because these permit the physiological changes and support the physiological changes. Frequently, we make this a rather silly objective thing. We give you specialties of diet. You should eat no meat, let us say. You shouldn't smoke. You shouldn't drink coffee. You shouldn't touch alcohol. You should have no cigarettes. Not even a cup of tea. But in that restriction of self, you're building up an intensity. You're doing without these simple things of stimulus to the spirit so you can be more stimulated by other things. properly, that is all right. Any regimen of habit that amounts to a rehearsal of experiential experience is wonderful for the higher faculties of life. It doesn't even have to be called a spiritual experience. It can be a purely secular. That makes no difference. The point is that the habit nature is disciplined by a will, by an idea to use it. The body is being put to work. The workman takes care of his tools. He keeps them oiled and all the rest of it. We remodeled a house last winter. The workmen left their tools all over the place, and I left all our tools and equipment out. When we were all through, there was an exceedingly minimal misdistribution. Each workman ultimately went away with his tools. He didn't go away with ours, and ours were there. Everything was in its place, and what seemed to be utmost confusion was not confusion at all, because each individual was sensitive to his own tools, his own faculties. He looked after his own. This rehearsal is important in extrasensory perception. We can't drift along in life with no extras in life, extra dealing with ourselves, and have any extra perception. Extra perception doesn't come to people who have no extras otherwise. There's the balance of the extras in the cradling reality for the extra perception up here. That's almost as the laws of the Medes and Persians. And so the prophet Ezekiel, the man who shaped the Hebrew Torah, the man who, with Jeremiah at least, was responsible for the whole development of the Old Testament, Ezekiel was responsible for the idea that ritualistic crime is a greater crime than social crime. If you commit a crime against society, society will punish you. Society takes care of its own. But the spiritual crime is against yourself, and the breaking of the rhythm, the breaking of the discipline, breaking of the elements that bring intensity to yourself is the great crime. The unforgivable crime in the sense that the consequences are irrevocable. If an individual has a loyalty to which he has a rhythmic, for which he has a rhythmic rehearsal, then the penalty is terrible. We need to discipline ourselves in our habits, and that's a discipline of the body. That's a discipline of this everyday life. You see, what I'm talking about, I'm trying to drive home and dramatize the necessity that if we're dealing with this extra thing here is only achieved on a foundation of bringing in an extra quality in this ordinary thing. Person says, I'm not interested in the body, I'm not interested, only interested in spiritual things up here, is simply deluding himself. And he's on his way to complete mental imbalance, because there's no foundation for what he is. If he throws his foundation away, what is it? It's like the suicide. He destroys the physical body, and then he hasn't any physical body, but he still has his lifespan. So he hangs around on the lower astral world, a nuisance to psychics of the lower order, and certainly a most unhappy individual as he himself is concerned, to the degree you can call him an individual. The idea then becomes a matter of the use of our physical vehicle and the use of our faculties. They have a normal basis, and we keep the normal basis in order, and then to the normal basis we add the supernormal basis. And in that, there are many things to which we can give attention. There is the matter of making oneself the vehicle of a greater intelligence. Newton said, when they said he was a genius, he said, I'm no genius, I simply stand on the shoulders of giants. So an individual can stand on the shoulders of giant intelligence before him. In the occult tradition, he can see the great insights of great individuals in this field and say, I can do that. I can be that. As I have the story, the founder of one of our modern organizations, the Rosicrucian Fellowship, Max Heindel, in the day that he was interested in Augusta Foss before they were married, arranged to meet her at a lecture. And as I have the story, it was a lecture by Charles Leadbeater, the Theosophist. So Max Heindel, who was a Marine engineer, went there to meet her. It was a little ahead of time, and the meeting was going on. He stepped in and listened to Leadbeater. Leadbeater was talking about these things, and Max Heindel said to himself, he can do that, I can do that. That was the start. I can stand on the shoulders of Leadbeater, well, for a moment perhaps, and then on the shoulders of those on whom Leadbeater stood. In the tradition, a part of the tradition. An individual sees a group of people, and this group of people stand for this. He says, I want in there. He could get in there by standing on the shoulders of the people there and what they are doing. In our child psychology, we have the phenomenon of parallel play. Little children are playing here. A new child comes up. They pay no attention to the new child. The new child can't get in that circle. They're doing these things with each other. So the new child watches it for a while, and then it seems interesting, and so on the outside, he does what they do. In his play, he parallels their play. As they see that he's doing what they are doing, they make room and they bring him in. It is the basic factor of human association, of human relationship, as we see these things and gain a sense of participation in them and with them and the like. That's the way we become more mature. That's the way we fulfill ourselves. That's the way life becomes more interesting. So in this occult field, basic thing is to ourselves be participants in it and not merely audiences in the grandstand, looking on and watching it as a show. And the way we come in is to bring what we have, which is no more than those who are in have, namely a physical body as the basic agency for it. So in the physical body, we get the development of the intensity, which is a basis. Well, you do that by the tears, by your sympathy, and you do that with everything else. Don't do anything with the physical body except it is a thrill. Unless you can get a great adventure out of dressing, don't dress. Stay in bed. Might as well, as far as your usefulness to society or yourself is concerned. If you eat, it's an adventure. Or don't eat. The animals eat to stay alive. The birds eat all the time. But must you eat? No. You can get along on a few grains of rice as far as staying alive is concerned. If you eat, it's an adventure. Or it's a social proposition. You're eating with other people. But if you just put it in your mouth without any idea of what it is and stuff it and pass it through yourself with so much substance, you're sunk. As far as anything spiritual is concerned, this should be an adventure. It's an intensification. Everything you do, everything you say, everything you wear, everything you dream, everything you think should be an intensification of the basic being, so that there is a super here in this matter of the physical, which is our basis, which is our anchors. And then on top of that, we begin to have the superphysical, which is not an escape and unreliable, but is a reality because we have lived it first in the core of what we are reaching out to get. This is the physical foundation of the superphysical phenomenon in every area, every department, and in every way. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now let's pick the audience up. Now this is the question session, and will you be a little patient if I have difficulty hearing the questions, because I have an odd kind of hearing defect. Some things, most things I can hear perfectly all right, but some things I have difficulty hearing, and some voices I have difficulty hearing. So if I have to walk down to get the question, please don't take it personally. How are the questions?
Can one help another person to achieve that intensity if they have not?
Any person can help another person to achieve that intensity, provided the other person wants it.
But if the other person doesn't want it, can
Then you can't help. Then it's none of your business. That is, there's a basic spiritual law which I like to call myob. MYOB, from the phrase M for mine, Y your, O own, B business. You see, we have to recognize the spiritual integrity of the human soul. And so while we are our brother's keeper as a social proposition, we are responsible for the welfare of all people of our group with whom we are associated in that way. But when it comes to entering into the other person's consciousness and deciding what is good for him, then we're in trouble. I like to say it this way, there was a man that said about reformers and the like, he said, have you ever noticed that the people who give their lives to doing other people good end up by doing other people good? So we have to have respect for personality. And so you can help the other person if he permits the help. But if he doesn't permit the help, and it's none of your business. If his business is your business, then you approach it in terms of your business. That is, don't ever say in your prayers, dear God, please make Bill have some sense. But you say to God, dear God, please help me work things out with Bill. Put your emphasis on yourself. That clear?
Oh, yeah.
Any other question?
Dr. When someone reaches this intensification of, in say, mysticism or in any experience, you know if what is called the aura starts to expand.
The aura expands always to the periphery necessary to include any element of experience, even normal circumstances. Now we begin to need some definition of terms, because we don't always use them the same way. Now, I use aura as applicable to what we normally call the astral body, not to what we normally call the etheric double. Is that the way you're using it?
I believe so.
When we deal with the aura in the sense of the astral body, it is outside time and space, so that spatially, its extent in space is merely a roundabout way of defining the pertinency of things in time and space in that aura. And so the simplest way to say it is that the aura promptly expands to whatever degree is necessary to include all pertinent factors in the time and space complex. Fair? Or no?
I think so. Some thought it will be.
Would you say there that in a sense the non-spatial attributes precipitates into the necessary spatial conditions.
They precipitate in the sense that there is an elimination of the difficulty of spatial. There is an elimination of spatial. There is the elimination of spatial limitation in this pertinent aspect. For instance, if I get word that someone on the Pacific coast is in special need or something like that. Let us say I'm doing healing work. And so it's for a person on the Pacific coast. Well, promptly the space distance to the Pacific coast disappears. The person might just as well be in the room. There's no difference as far as healing work is concerned with a person that is right here in the room, a person on the Pacific coast. In that sense, the non-spatial distinction disappears in its precipitation down here. So if that's what you mean, that's correct, as I see it. Mm-hmm.
Dr. John, your mention of a theory about the vaporization of the blood in the brain, do the proponents of that theory go into any great detail to attempt to explain in physical terms how this might take place?
How the vaporization takes place? Only in all probability, as near as I could figure or attempt to explain it to myself, in the factor of compressibility of pressure. Now, what makes the difference between solidity, liquidity, and gaseousness? Well, it's primarily temperature, but also pressure is a very great factor, as we know through all physical science. And the brain structures with the bone, the structures of the bone there, and the absolute non-compressibility of the bone makes possible pressure, as we find in many phenomena, as in many brain ailments from a physical point of view, or actually your high blood pressure phenomena, the stroke and that sort of thing, where the pressure comes in as a very great factor. Now, the limitation in the blood circulatory vessels, the arteries and the veins, where there is congestion leading to high blood pressure, very frequently precipitates a condition as far as the consciousness is concerned, which to me suggests the fact that pressure is a factor in the brain itself. But it's pure conjecture. I never have been able to find any medical investigation on the subject, and the very great difficulty in any extrasensory investigation is that the extrasensory investigation does not screen out difficulties of language. If, let us say, as a psychic matter, I approach something out here to the degree that it is pertinent to my experience, that I have anchorage for it, I can get an accurate impression. But when I come to put that accurate impression in words, I have to put it in words of my own experience, and I may distort it tremendously. And I have no way of knowing whether I distort it or not.
Well, I raised the question because looking at it scientifically, you can calculate the transfer of energy involved in changing pressures or temperatures in order to accommodate, or rather in order to accomplish the vaporization of a certain amount of liquid.
Yeah.
And the energy transfer involved are pretty great.
Yeah, tremendous.
And therefore, this can be measured in terms of fuel consumed by the machine that is accomplishing this change. And I bring that up because tests, which reports of which I have read anyhow, seem to indicate that there is practically no energy consumption by the brain involved in the processes of any of the known processes of thinking.
Yeah, that is very true. Every test of which I have read shows that the energy consumption is slight. The various measures that have been made of electrical phenomena show a very slight variation, which is the same thing from another point of view. But the physical quantity of blood that needs to be vaporized in significant sections of the brain, in theory, can be infinitesimally small, so that it's not most scientific investigation is let's be honest with ourselves. Most scientific investigation seems to close out the possibility of the occult theory. But on the other hand, when we find the extraordinary susceptibility of the human consciousness and the continuity of human consciousness to the slightest diminution of the blood supply to the brain, seems to show also that there's another factor in there, and that brings back a swing to the occult theory. So that 10 or 15 years ago, I was intended to dismiss the idea of vaporization altogether. And then with this recent, especially connected with these heart operations and the freezing of the body, the lowering of the temperature, and the necessity to hold up the brain, and some of these devices they're working out now to supplement that and keep almost a separate supply for the brain.
It just deplete the amount of if the temperature is lower, it doesn't need much oxygen.
Now that's the point. But the brain needs the same normal amount, apparently.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
No, it doesn't need any more than the rest of it.
I see.
If you lower the temperature, the brain doesn't use much oxygen, therefore there's not much oxygen consumed, so you don't need much circulation. I think the doctor was going to go to the lungs. What? Doesn't go to the lungs? Yes, it's a normal circulation. Down. And the blood being goes down by 40, doesn't it? I think 40 beats per minute or 30, kind down to 40, I believe, in those operations. And I believe at 20 degrees down, it only uses about 1/10 as much oxygen as it does at the higher temperature. Therefore, they can have the cells without oxygen a longer period without harm.
Yeah. But there's a special difficulty connected with the brain, and there were recent, about a month ago, there were some reports that I read rather hurriedly, and then afterwards regretted that I hadn't held more of it in memory because it came up pertinent to this, which indicated that there was another factor entering into there, and a team, I think it was based partly on the work of a Swedish scientist in connection with some of the recent heart operations, where there's been a change in that. Now, I'm out of my field when I talk of these medical things in too much detail. I can sketch it in general and give the occult idea, but I can't speak authoritatively to the degree to which it is or is not substantiated. But there seems to be substantiation, at least to the extent that swung me back, again, to the simpler explanation of the vaporization of the blood. Now, a more complicated explanation may be necessary, but in general, the Occam's razor idea, if you can, hold to the simpler explanation, and in the long run, you end up more correctly. But whether the physical explanation is correct, whether I'm right or wrong in this, is interesting, but it is incidental to the main proposition that there is a point of intensity in the consciousness that proves itself in the occult over and over again when we deal with the extrasensory phenomena. So the catch in here is the catch of the parallel in the physical explanation. That's where the hole is, where we're dealing with, we're generalizing on very little material, which always is an error, which always is a risk. We're generalizing on very slight material. But they're straws in the wind, and because they are straws in the wind, I have felt on this trip where the matter has come up that it was relatively reasonable to accept the simpler occult explanation until perhaps difficulties drive to the more complicated explanation.
Point of view, that wouldn't be the simpler explanation.
Which is the simpler explanation?
Just simply that the brain needs oxygen greater to an even greater degree than the other bodies, because brain cells aren't completely reproduced.
Yes.
And so the main thing there is have to keep enough blood going through to have a sufficient amount of oxygen so that you don't get destruction of brain cells.
But now I'm lost because that's what I was saying. Now, where do we divide?
Well, I'm saying that what they do, they find that if they lower the temperature of the whole body and the brain included, then they don't have to have as rapid blood flow for any part, and especially for the brain. In other words, where they normally would only need to interfere with blood flow for 5 minutes, if they lower the temperature, they can easily cut the blood flow off for 20 minutes without injuring the brain.
Well, that's okay. Now, in this recent work where they had these long, prolonged operations running an hour and a half, they found they had particular trouble with the brain.
Well, they don't interfere with blood circulation for an hour and a half.
With the brain?
No, they now, for instance, they may have a patient in there, but for the small limited time that the blood flow is interrupted, it is never over 15 or 20 minutes.
Well, that was what I was intending to report. That they can, with safety, as far as the rest of the body is concerned, cut off the blood circulation and the oxygen supply for a longer period, but they can't do it with the brain.
Well, you get the function of the other cells too, but they can be replaced easily.
But that's all.
Function of the brain cells causes a definite change in the sanity or so forth, but you can destroy a brain cell down here without hurting you very much.
All right, now is it clear what the difference is here? Here, to this gentleman, the simpler explanation is that it is merely a matter of these fewer cells having their necessary oxygen. I'm saying that if the blood is vaporized, that whether it's few cells or many cells, the supply is necessary to sustain that vaporization, the pressure to sustain that vaporization. Can't see it?
No, it doesn't
Okay.
make logic to me.
All right, now in the peristaltic group, this should be interesting to you because if you're going to achieve anything in the peristaltic group, your problem is at no time necessarily coming to a decision whether this point of view is right or this point of view is right. Now, here's a competent mind over here which sees this as simpler. Here is a competent mind over here that sees this as simpler. And actually, it is unimportant. Actually, it is unimportant whether the blood vaporizes or not. But what is basically important is the intensification of experience which is necessary as a support for the superphysical or the supersensory phenomena. And you go with me on that. So there's a disagreement when we come down into the physical body as what is necessary in the physical body. Is that clear to you people? Because this to me is an interesting and a valuable feature of the discussion. The way to not, I'm not forgetting, don't worry. These questions are too valuable. The way to knowledge is not determining what is right and what is wrong, what is kosher and what isn't kosher. That's not the point. But the point is seeing the pertinency of these things and dealing with the pertinency of these things in a particular reference so that your thinking is straight. Now the question over here.
From my own experience, I have high blood pressure. I have the reaction when I get excited, when I have deeper feelings like I do right now as I talk to you. Now, when the enclosed vessel is under greater pressure, its tendency to vaporize is diminished. So if I get excited or elated, my blood pressure goes up. And I think that would contradict your theory about the vaporization.
Did not go up.
Yeah. Hmm?
230 blood pressure went without.
Yeah. Now,
Don't feel the pressure. Yes, it's hard. Is he trying to right now? Thank you.
come again, George?
Say, does he go to a doctor?
Does the pressure go up when it gets excited?
That's what he said.
Yes.
Who's that? He don't. Does he want his doctor?
Well, doesn't pressure go up when you get excited?
I don't know. I'm asking you.
Most people say so. That at least is medical science.
The thing I know is that when you're the first thing it does is your blood pressure. You're
Yeah.
driving your car, you're under tension,
Mhm.
you get there, it's the first thing he does.
Yeah.
It could be the last thing. When you leave, you take your blood pressure.
It takes us down. It goes down.
It goes down, you get
Sure.
yeah.
Surely. That
Why does it stop? It goes up. Well, let's think so.
I don't know. Maybe he is learned. If I heard him correctly, he started out by saying that he was the high blood pressure type. He said that, as I understand.
Don't thing when his pressure goes up, he gets excited. You just said the pressure goes up.
Well, I take his word for it. I'm being a literal-minded person. But it seems to me that if an individual says to me that I'm the high blood pressure type, I assume that he has certain symptoms in himself that he recognizes as a signal to him that the blood pressure is going up and be careful.
My understanding is exactly that too. I had a patient go to the Phenom hospital in Philadelphia. And the routine doctor takes her routine stuff when you go in the hospital.
Mhm.
They take my blood pressure, and the thing wouldn't work. The bulb was broken or something. So I'll give you a cardiogram. They gave me a cardiogram. Oh, they threw their hands up. You've got to take care of yourself. Scared my wife to death, scared the doctor. I just see a physician down there like that. I did it for quite some time. And we had a cardiogram made a year later. We had an ultrasound at the physical hospital. They got it. And when we took the cardiogram, there was no change in my heart condition. But I do have an indication of high blood pressure, which I'm trying to get rid of by reducing weight and food. So I don't know why this gentleman seems to know his blood pressure goes up. You can't.
Well, that I don't want to go into that because
No, you got
there are all kinds of possibilities. For all we know, maybe a hypochondriac. Who knows? Now, if you don't mind,
Well, I'd like to get my question answered.
well, I'm coming to it.
Oh,
Yeah. Now, everybody is aware of the fact if you want to liquefy air, you use pressure. You see, that's the point that you're making. In other words, in the hierarchy of the solidity and the liquefaction, the gases, and so forth. Now, the point that I was making in connection with pressure was not that the pressure produced the gaseousness. That was not the point, but that the gaseousness produced a pressure or a kind of pressure. And I was in error in a sense in using that term. In all phenomena, we have something that goes to infinity in any two given directions. We go to infinity this way, we go to infinity this way. But in between, we have a scale that we accept and we take in one way or another. And that scale of from solid to liquid to gas is the scale that is characteristic of our basis, because our basis is solidity, supporting liquidity in gaseousness. Now, there's another point of view that takes it the other way around from the characteristic of the gaseousness to the liquidity to the solidity. And here we have an enormous difficulty in semantics, as we always have in anything of the occult. The characteristic of gases is their capacity for equalizing themselves in the area where they may operate. It is true of liquids to a much less extent, but it is also true of liquids. It is not true of solids at all. So, in a broader point, from a different point of view, solidity is the basis of our time and space stability, in which experience takes place, in which consciousness functions. But that's the anchorage. And so in that, there is the liquidity, which is the phenomenon of life in the largest possible way, where there is a flow, where there are cycles and the like. And then there is the phenomenon of gaseousness, which in the largest possible symbolical way of stating is consciousness, the characteristic of which is that it fulfills, that it spreads through a certain area, so that you can't pump a chamber, you can't get an absolute vacuum. You can get more and more out with a vacuum pump, but what is left always diffuses itself. Now, when we speak of the vaporization of the blood represents the liquid tissue among the solid tissues of the body. So the blood represents the life as against the stability in time and space existence of the body. Now, in that, we deal with gases in the oxygen cycle, the oxygen and the carbon and the carbon dioxide, where the tissues break down, the giving of the oxygen and the like. We use the gases that way as we use the liquids in the nitrogen cycle in the health of the body. The substances that come in are incidental to that. The substances are largely liquid anyway. What we eat chemically is largely liquid. Symbolically, we have to oversimplify, and in oversimplifying symbolically, we sometimes state things badly scientifically. To put in all of the exceptions and so forth means that it looks to the uninitiated as though you were going around Robin Hood's barn, bringing in this and this and this and this. That's why the question sessions are valuable, because where there are particular difficulties, we can get down to the details of them. Now, in the gaseousness cycle, which is analogous to consciousness, if the blood tissue, which solidifies, clots, as a basis of its functioning under many circumstances, which clots as a basis for the destruction of life under other circumstances, where death is caused by a blood clot. that balance as it works into the solidity is part of it. The blood carries solid substance in a sense, the nutriment elements that are taken to the tissues. So it mediates on this area. Theoretically, from the occult point of view, it should mediate on the gaseous element also, and it does so by carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, over and above all that, the occult theory is that the blood becomes gaseous in certain focal areas where consciousness centers. So I made the mistake of speaking of that relative to or analogous to the pressure of emotion. But the pressure of emotion is not pressure in this physical sense. See, my handicap is that I have to use the word pressure for two entirely different things. We have the semantics difficulty all through occultism. We don't have an adequate language. And if we had an adequate language, it would be like the scientific language, only the scientists would understand it, only the specialists would understand it. So when I spoke of the intensity of experience, the development of the experience in that way, or the incandescence of experience, which is even a better way of explaining it, I was making that analogous to this quality of the blood in these limited sections of the brain, theoretically, where there is a constant rectification or distribution, and that I was visualizing as, in a sense, a pressure outward, not as a pressure on the blood, but a pressure of the blood in its gaseous nature, as very largely a psychological rather than a physical. Man is a whole, and we have to cross over the line from the physical to the psychic. But we make the separation to talk about it. But actually, somewhere there is a division over. Well, where is that? Well, the blood cavity, the bone cavity permits that because it is inflexible. And so, as there is this tendency in consciousness against this, we have something which I described as pressure, but which in my own mind was not the kind of pressure which, as you pointed out, in terms of, somebody pointed out, in terms of physics, is that's the way you get liquid air. It's compression. Cooling, yes, but the compression permits cooling. Now, here, I'm at the threshold of my knowledge. When I'm able to read, when I'm able to find out, I'm at the threshold because it goes off into infinite variation for which I have no language. Now, these scientific facts are perfectly correct. I go with that all the way through. But there is here, in this unexplainable area, something that has to make sense both physically and psychically. And to make it make sense physically, the occult theory that I find, you see, that's why I say it's the simplest theory I know to explain it. But like all such explanations, it breaks down when it is subjected to two critical analysis with these canons here. Do these canons hold? I don't know. But I do know now, with the research down to absolute zero, that our canons in the tables of metals and valences and the like break down. Metals that are conductors above here are not conductors down here, and vice versa. And it is so mixed up down to zero temperatures that I can't make head or tail of it anymore, not being that much of a chemist or a physicist. So that if we get up to this up here, which is not exactly temperature in the same sense, but in terms of physiological operation is something of the same kind. These canons break down. I have no language. I can only speak symbolic. The purpose of the symbolical speaking is to give the individual a sense that if he likes these things, a certain type of intensity of experience or incandescence of experience is necessary. I'm trying to knock out the idea that a moral canon has meaning, that you do it because you're good and you can't do it if you're bad. Now, if you're good, that makes life better for you. If you're bad, it makes it harder for you. But the proposition is the intensity. And if by being bad you get the intensity to a significant degree, it may be more important historically than the person who is good. But when we're talking about bad and good, that's one thing. That's you personally and your problems of karma and all the rest of it. But if you're speaking about society, the individual who to society may be a very bad actor, may be very useful in the history of the development of society. I'm trying to keep the moral standard one thing and the utilitarian standard another thing.
I'd like to talk about what to me is an analogy is in the theater.
It's in
The theater,
the theory.
when a great actor is playing a part that requires say, a tragic part, and he may, if he works up this intensification of feeling in himself, the audience will react. They're
Yeah.
separated from him in space. They will be moved as he is moved. The next night he may do it again and not be able to do this.
Yeah.
We do the same, go through the same motions and
Mm.
same part again, but the audience will not be moved.
Mhm.
So there must be something, in my mind, that goes out in context. To me, that is what you're saying.
Yeah. You see that you have the two factors. You have the factor out here and the factor in here. In New York, where shows now, the cost of mounting a show in New York gets higher and higher and higher all the time. You can't mount a musical under $300,000 now. And so they have a hedge against that by selling theater parties. A theater party is an institution where the theater owner gets the same rate for the ticket, or possibly he may pay a commission. And then it is sold to charity. So a $7.50 ticket is sold to charity for $25. Well, the person who comes is there with all his friends. He's paid $25 for the ticket. He's partly interested in the show. He's largely interested in his friends. And the actors and actresses in New York get so they simply dread these theater parties. They can't get over to the theater party because there's no rapport. But the individual who is spending his money to go to the theater and is there to see the show, then there is a rapport. And of course, the greater the actor, the more he can mount that, the more he can get over no matter what. And that's your periphery. That's this matter of the limitation of the oral. But it's exceedingly difficult to get over an audience where there's no basic rapport. On one of my travels, I had an audience wished on me that was made up of people who went hiking. And I was supposed to interest them to come to a philosophical lecture. There couldn't have been a greater proposition in there. So I had to choose, maybe to try to get through to one or two people against an opposition of an unwilling audience that would just wish that I would shut up and get out of there, or to get some kind of rapport with the audience, even if it was off the subject. So to get a rapport, I had nothing to draw on, particularly as far as hiking clubs are concerned. I didn't know the local people. They all knew each other. But luck was with me because there was one exceedingly stout individual there who was a member of the hiking club. So the incongruity of this stout man and his problems in hiking and not hiking were of universal language. I could talk about that. So in a kind of a way and so forth, I came back to this and back and forth and so forth. The audience was with me. I was with the audience. We had a perfectly wonderful time because I had a medium between them and myself in the obvious fact that a man as big as that in a hiking club, an active member in a hiking club, raised issues that were a universal language and we could talk about. So there was a proposition of a putover there. But if I were playing Hamlet and the audience knew nothing about Shakespeare and the audience had no appreciation for the fact that the language of Shakespeare has to be declaimed. It's not people speaking. It's a kind of the only word that I have for it is declaiming. It's declaimed. It's a particular art. And if you have an audience totally unfamiliar with this, the hardest thing in the world to put over because there is no rapport. We are in rapport with each other, and in extrasensory perception, we're trying to find out the nature of that rapport so we can deal with it constructively. We can help in healing and work out all these various problems. Well, I think.
Would you say that this intensification is the same as we speak to many kinds of heightened awareness?
Yes. Intensification is heightened awareness, another phrase for the same thing. I think, I'm looking at the clock back there, and it's 19 minutes of 11. I think that probably this is a reasonable time to say goodnight and to thank you for your attention and to hope that perhaps I have stimulated your realization a little to these problems of the extrasensory perception, its use and nature. I thank you.
Okay.